When it comes to garment sewing, I kind of nerd out on the details a little bit, or actually a lot, and I so appreciate a really nicely finished interior on a garment. And that's not to say that you have to finish your garments perfectly every single time. I definitely don't. There are plenty of times I just use the serger to finish things, but when I have the time to do it, I really enjoy doing it well. Lately, I've been working on samples for my latest pattern release, the Vivi Blouse and Dress. One of the sources of inspiration for me when I was developing this pattern were these long line vests that I was seeing on Pinterest. They've got a very like classic 90s vibe going, and that is like right up my alley. So I decided I wanted to make myself another version of this pattern that was sleeveless, just the blouse, so that it kind of looks like that vest style. Now on the other two sleeveless versions that I've made of this pattern, I just used the facings that came with the pattern to finish the armhole. But for this black vest that I'm making, I actually want to try a bias bound armhole finish. If you've ever tried bias binding, you may know that sometimes it's hard to get it, smoothed around all of those curves of a garment just so. But I have learned a few tips and tricks that I'm going to share with you guys today for how to get a nice smooth finish on your bias binding. And if you don't know what a bias binding is, it is just a strip of fabric that is cut on the bias of the fabric, so it has a little bit of stretch and give to it, which makes it a little easier to work it around the curves of a garment. It's often used to finish necklines and armholes of garments. It can also be used as a seam finish for the interior of your garment, so it is pretty versatile, and it's a way to add a little extra character to your garments. You can use contrasting fabrics. You can also stash bust. It's a great way to use up small pieces of fabric that may be left over from other projects. You can buy bias binding already pre-made, already pre-folded and pressed for you, or you can make your own. I prefer to make my own just because it is quite easy. I always have scrap fabric on hand that can be made into bias tape pretty easily. I've already gone ahead and sewn up this blouse. I've done everything except for add the bias binding to the armhole, so we're just going to focus on that today. Now, typically I use scraps to make my bias binding, but I did recently get some fabric from Blackbird Fabrics. They have a gorgeous line of block printed fabrics that I have really been enjoying. This shirt is actually made out of one of their block prints, and I'll show you the other fabric. So I got this really beautiful black background with kind of earth-toned floral print fabric. I am going to use some of this to make the bias binding because it'll coordinate well with my black vest that I've made. And I like to make sure that my fabric is really well pressed before I cut it out, just to make sure that I'm getting as perfect a square as possible. And you can really use, just about any woven fabric that you want to make a bias binding. With a knit fabric, you really don't need to cut it on the bias because it's already stretchy, but woven fabrics work best for a bias binding. So I'm just going to make sure I get this really nice and pressed. This block printed fabric is a cotton fabric, and it does have a pretty stable weave, so this will be perfect for making our bias binding because we'll be able to really get this on grain and make sure that everything's nice and straight before we cut it out. Okay, I think that's pretty good. Now I'm going to cut my square. Now I did make a little chart for you guys and some written instructions. If you want to print this out, I'll put a link to that in the description for this video. So I usually kind of go on the lower end of this chart. I usually do somewhere between 10 and 12 inches for my square. You can really get, surprisingly, a lot of bias tape out of that. But this chart will show you how much length approximately you can get out of each square. I'm going to do mine 2 inches wide. So if I look on the chart here, 12 inches square by 2 inches wide, that's going to give me about 64 inches of bias tape, which is, I know, plenty of bias tape, but I kind of would like to have a little extra. I'm starting out by lining this up with my cutting mat. It really helps if you have a cutting mat and a rotary cutter. It makes cutting the perfect square a lot easier. And then I'll use this really nice big clear quilting ruler to cut out my square with my rotary cutter. Once we have our square cut perfectly, we're going to cut it in half diagonally. So we're cutting it on the bias from corner to corner so that now we have two equally sized triangles. Then we're going to put the triangles right sides together. In this fabric, it's kind of hard to tell what's right side and wrong side. We're going to put the triangles right sides together, and we just want to overlap that corner at the edge by about 3/8 inch on both sides. Then we're going to sew that top edge together with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And the seam allowance doesn't really matter. You could do a 1/4 inch, you could do a 1/2 inch, whatever you're most comfortable with, but whatever seam allowance you do, you want to make sure that that corner overhangs the edge by the same amount. So because I'm doing a 3/8 inch seam allowance, this is overhanging by 3/8 inch. Next, we just need to press that seam allowance open. And now we're left with this lovely trapezoid shape. The next thing we want to do is draft lines on our fabric to help us with cutting the strips and also sewing the whole thing together and making it a continuous bias strip project. So I'm going to let my cutting mat grid assist me with this. And I'm going to lay the fabric vertically so that it's the longest direction is vertical. And I'm going to line it up with the grid on my cutting mat. And once again, I'm going to use my clear quilting ruler to help me draw these. I'm also going to use heat soluble pens to draft the lines. I love these pens. I've use them almost every single video. People do ask me about them, but I really like the white ones the best, and I get these on Amazon. So be sure to check the links in the description for anything like that. I'm just gonna line this up and draw a line every 2 inches starting at the very edge of the fabric. And I wanna make sure I get everything really nice and straight. And that's why I love these quilting rulers, because you can really see what you're doing. And I'll continue doing that every 2 inches. And then I also want to draw a seam allowance on the 2 shorter ends at 3/8 inch. So I'm just going to line that up with my lines on my cutting mat again and draw in the seam allowance. And I'm doing all of this on the wrong side of fabric. Now this piece of fabric worked out that I had enough for exactly 4 rows spaced 2 inches apart. If you do end up with a row that is too short, you'll want to trim that off and discard it, because you want all of your rows to be exactly the same. So now we're going to turn this over wrong side down and also in that vertical position. And I'm just going to take the bottom and fold it up toward the top. So now we want to match up this edge of the fabric with this edge. So both of the shorter edges. And you'll see that, you know, just folding them in half, it doesn't match up. It's going to be a little awkward. So now we have to kind of twist things so that that side can meet up with that side. And as you can see, the fabric gets kind of bunched up and weird. That's okay. We just want to make sure that we match up this side with this side, and we're also offsetting it by 1 row. So instead of matching up this corner here with that corner at the top, we're actually offsetting it by 1 row. And this is the most awkward part, which is why we also drew all these lines to help us line everything up. So this one, since it's the first line, is going to align with the corner here. But I like to start with the second row just because it's easier to kind of get it lined up first. So I'm going to take a pin and stick it right through where those 2 lines cross. I don't know if you can see that. So there's my row line, there's my seam allowance. I've got my pin right through that point. And I'm going to find that point on the other side. So there it is right there. So I've got my pin going right through right there. And then I want to kind of twist it so that that edge matches up. And it's so hard to show this because it is just such an awkward way to match the fabric. But once it all comes together, you'll be like, ah, yes, I see now. It makes so much sense and it's so easy. So I'm going to do that for the rest of the rows. And for this one, it's a pretty small piece. So I only have like 3 or 4 rows to line up. Again, sticking it right through that cross there, going to the next row on the other side, making sure that I'm putting these right sides together. Go right through the cross there. Kind of straighten it out a little bit at that edge and pinning it together. So I like to just kind of come in and trim off that extra little seam allowance. That's where we sewed the 2 pieces together, just to make that corner easier to see. So there's the corner of one side, and that needs to align with the row and the seam allowance point on this side. So I'm just going to kind of line that up and put a pin there. And then do the same thing for the other side. I'm just going to trim that off just to make it easier to see. So there's the corner there. There's where the seam allowance and the row lines cross. I'm just making sure that that matches up right at that point. So now I can kind of lay it like that. And I'm going to sew this seam here, again with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And here is our cylinder all sewn. There's the seam we just sewed, and you can see that our row lines are lining up here on either side of that seam allowance. Now, I'm not going to press this seam open because I did use a heat soluble pin. It'll just erase the lines. I need to see those lines. The next thing we're gonna do is just cut along the line, starting at one of these loose ends, and continue in a spiral motion to cut a continuous strip of bias tape. Now this next step is probably one of the most important parts of getting a clean, very smooth finish on your bias bindings. So one of the tips that I learned was to stretch the bias tape before you install it. You can do this before or after you put the folds in the bias tape, but I like to do it before. I just feel like it's a little easier to do it that way. So what you're gonna do is press the bias tape with a lot of steam. Now, my iron does not handle water very well, so I don't use steam in my iron, but I do have a little misting bottle. I love these little misting bottles. I get these on Amazon, and they're awesome. So they just put a really fine mist of water on the project. So whenever I'm needing some steam, I'll use these instead. And I do have these linked in my Amazon storefront if you want to get these for yourself. Before I do that, I'm going to just press open all of these seam allowances from when I sewed this together earlier. Now that I've got this cut, I don't need those little lines that I drew to stay on here. It's okay if they erase. So I'm going to start on the left side here, and I'm just going to give it a little mist and press it while pulling it underneath the iron. So I'm really stretching this kind of aggressively. And I'll just continue that down the length of the bias tape. And you can see that you also get a reduction in the width. So here's part of it that I have not stretched out yet. And then it probably reduced the width on this by about, I don't know, about 3/8 of an inch. So it does reduce the width. So I just like to overestimate the width a little bit because I know that when I stretch it, I'm gonna lose some of that width. So my finished width on this is about 1.5 inches wide once I stretch it. And I also just want to go through and clean up the edges a little bit and trim off some of these seam allowance points that are kind of sticking out over the edge. That's just going to make it easier once we start folding the bias tape. So now we're ready to add the folds to our bias tape. And pre-pressing the folds like this will aid in helping us install the bias tape later, just to have all of that done. So you have a couple of options for doing this. You can just fold in the edges of the bias tape and press them down along the entire length of the bias tape. You can do this by hand. That's one way to do it, and that will work just fine. But what I like to use are these little bias tape makers. I just bought a whole pack of these off of Amazon. Again, I'll put a link to those in my Amazon storefront, but they come in multiple different widths. I kind of want to have a finished width of about 3/4 inch when I'm done with this, so I'm going to use the 18mm. So to use these, you just slip the fabric into the bias tape maker, and you want to make sure that the flat part of the bias tape maker is on your surface, on your tabletop surface, and then you want the fabric to be wrong side facing up. Kind of get it started with your iron, and then you can kind of keep pulling it through. Now, one thing about doing it like this that I don't like is sometimes it can get a little bit bunched up underneath on the right side. So a trick that I like to do is to kind of flip the little handle down, insert the fabric on top of the handle through the bias tape maker. You'll pull it through the exact same way, except it's also going through that little handle. So you'll pull it through, get it kind of started. I'll just usually press the end. Then I'll flip over the bias tape maker so that now that little handle is on top of the fabric, and I can iron this from the right side and pull that right along. And it just kind of helps keep that right side of fabric from getting wrinkled and pressing those wrinkles into the bias tape. And for me, it just helps me keep everything really nice and controlled, and the finished bias tape is extra, extra nice and folded perfectly. I don't even know why it works so well that way, but I like it a lot better to flip it over like that. So I'll just do this for the entire length of the bias tape. And it goes really fast with these little bias tape makers. I love these things so much. When you get to those seams where you kind of matched up the parts of the square together, it may kind of stick a little bit. Just kind of give it a little tug and it should come right through. Just keep going. And that handle also kind of helps keep the fabric pushed down so it goes right into that little channel just right. Voila, all done. So basically we've created what's called a single fold bias tape, even though it has 2 folds in it. This is known as single fold. And to create double fold, you would just fold this in half and press that, and then you'd have a double fold bias tape. So something like a double fold would actually be used to finish the edge of something like a quilt or even the edge of a seam. So this right here is an example of how double fold bias tape was used to finish the edge of this ironing mat, which I have a tutorial for how to make this ironing mat here on my channel. I'll link it for you guys. So I've got my sleeveless blouse here. We are ready to start installing the bias tape. Now, the next most important step, actually this might be more important than stretching, But the next important step that we want to do is to pre-shape the bias binding to fit the armscye. So I've just got the blouse laid here on the table, nice and flat, and I'm going to take my bias tape and start kind of shaping it into the same general shape as the armscye. So pre-curving it like this is also going to help with that installation and make it nice and smooth. I'll give myself a little bit of extra, maybe like 1.5 inches or so of a tail, and I'm just trying to kind of make it curve in the same shape as the armscye. So I want this piece to curve up a little bit more. And I'm just taking my time and kind of manipulating the fabric into that curved shape. And for the back, I will do the same thing. And actually, you can probably just kind of drag this down here and curve it around again at the top. So I'm kind of guesstimating a little bit too. I'm not being super duper precise, but I just kind of want to get that curve pressed in there and also maintain those folds that I've already pressed in there. To install the bias bindings, you want to make sure that the folded side is facing up and the blouse is right side out. My seam allowance for this is 5/8 inch. The fold that I have here is not quite 1/2 inch, so I want to scoot that down just a little bit because I'm going to be using the fold of the bias tape here as my seam allowance guide, so I just want to make sure that that's offset from the edge of the armscye there so that I accommodate for that 5/8 inch seam allowance all the way around the armscye. And when I pin this to the armscye, I want to make sure I give myself about 1 inch of excess past that point because that's going to help me finish this bias tape once I come back to the start. And you can pin this all the way around the armscye, but I don't like to do that. I like to kind of leave myself some room to continue to manipulate this as I pull it through the machine. And I'm just going to take my time, go slow, and make sure that I keep everything nice and flat as I go under the sewing machine needle. Now, when you get to the end, there's a couple ways you can do this. You could stop and sew these pieces together here. What I like to do is just fold under the piece where I started and then let this piece overlap it. And then that'll kind of finish that so it has a nice finished edge. And then this piece will get trimmed here, but then when you flip it up, that will be concealed underneath there. Now I can trim down the seam allowance here just so that it doesn't create too much bulk. I meant to press record and I didn't, but I basically just went through and understitched all of this bias binding to the seam allowance on the opposite side. Now I can just press this toward the interior of the bodice and then top stitch it in place all the way around the armscye. So I'm super pleased with how this little vest sleeveless shirt situation turned out. I know this video is really more about the bias binding, but I did want to kind of touch on a few things about kind of the pattern hacks and the way I'm styling this and the way I plan to wear this. I know I'm going to be wearing this all summer long. I did modify the skirt portion of the pattern, so I just kind of folded back the pattern piece and tapered it, you know, back toward the center front. And I only folded it back maybe 1.5 inches just to kind of get that little split effect because I really liked the way that that looked in all of the inspiration images that I was finding for these vests. And then just sewed on the placket and attached it to the bodice as shown in the instructions. I also added a little lining. So I had some fabric in my stash that I thrifted forever ago, just some kind of like basic polyester lining fabric. And it was perfect for this because this fabric was kind of catching on my clothes. It was kind of getting stuck, you know, kind of up on my hips a little bit. And I just wanted it to lay really nice and flat. So putting a little lining in just on the skirt portion actually worked beautifully. I like being able to see my pants peeking through this little split opening. It just kind of breaks up the length a little bit and adds a little bit more visual interest. And also this V at the bottom kind of mimics the V at the top. I think it's just a nice little added detail that I really liked in all of the vest pictures that I was finding. And I couldn't resist. I was gonna get this video out actually a couple of days sooner than I did, but I really wanted to make a pair of shorts to go with this vest. So I had made like a little linen short set. And I actually would love to make another set like this in like a natural colored linen. I think that would be so cute. And then I could also mix and match the set because I really did like the way this vest looked with my linen pants that I have and also a pair of khaki shorts that I have. And I've really been trying to incorporate a lot more wearable pieces in my wardrobe Because I can sew, I tend to kind of put pressure on myself to make things that are a little bit probably more out of my comfort zone for day-to-day wear. So I want more pieces like this that have a little bit of that tailored effect, but feel casual enough to wear every day, you know, getting groceries, running errands, doing all of those things, but also could be cute for, you know, a dinner party in the summer. Not that I ever go to any dinner parties, but anyway, if I do, I have something to wear. Also, thank you to my Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much for supporting me over there. If you'd like to join Patreon and kind of support the work that I do here on YouTube and also get some additional content and occasional downloads that go along with the YouTube content, be sure to follow me over there. I do some behind the scenes stuff. Last week I posted a video showing how I made the covered buttons for this blouse and also gave some little chatty life updates. So be sure to check that out if that's something that you're interested in. But if not, you can continue to support me by watching the videos, giving me a thumbs up, leaving a comment, letting me know what you think. And yeah, thank you guys so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed this video and I will see you in the next video. Bye.